Hi, Sheila. Welcome back to the A World of Difference podcast again.
Thanks, Lori. Good to be here.
Yes, it is good to see you. I know that since we last had you on the show, your book did incredibly well, The Great Sex Rescue. And we kind of had you on early on when that first was coming out. And now you're releasing another book, She Deserves Better, and it's doing really well. And I'm so excited for you. And I'm
hmm
excited for people to hear about your book if they haven't. So, how are you feeling about the book release right now?
We're really shocked because I always thought Great Sex Rescue would be the big book, but I think people really want something different for their kids, and that's what this is all about. Is our kids deserve better? We were really harmed, and I think a lot of parents are thinking, okay, I don't know how to raise my kids now because I don't want them to have the toxic stuff I did, but I also don't want to tell them go do whatever you want.
Hmm.
So it's no one knows what to do anymore, and so we're trying to answer that question.
Yes, and I thank you because it's so brave. And as people unpack what to do with their kids, they're often women and men are still unpacking what happened to them. And so it can
Mhm.
bring up hard things, hard conversations. And those, they're not easy to talk about with adults, between adults, much less processing all that as a parent with your kid. And so, as you were writing, She Deserves Better with your daughter, also, who does great work alongside you and all the research you guys are helping us all learn from. What was that process like of writing together?
It was fun. I like to say that Rebecca, all the snarky lines are hers. Like she comes up with the best one-liners. So I have to sketch the book out. She does a lot of the editing, and then she also does our survey design and our focus groups. And then Joanna Sawatsky, our third co-author, runs all the stats for us because I don't know any of that stuff. So we really needed all three of us to get the project done. And it's fun because this is very much a book largely coming out of purity culture. What happened during those 20 years, maybe 1995 to 2015, but even some still now,
Mhm.
when church really changed. And so both my co-authors, my daughter Rebecca and Joanna Sawatsky, they grew up, they're millennials, and so they grew up in purity culture. I didn't. And so we had very different perspectives on our teen years in church, and that was interesting.
It is interesting. Yes, I'm a Gen Xer as well, and then grew up in Latin America, and everything's just totally different in that situation. But I have observed my millennial friends that were growing up in evangelical and white evangelical church in America. They really got hit hard with some of these messages, and it's really heartbreaking. It's not that I didn't experience it at all, even in my adult years. I would say there were things going on living overseas in Southern Baptist world with Americans from overseas who had moved to Asia, and they brought in a lot of things like, we're going to be going to this meeting in Bali, but the women shouldn't have their shoulders uncovered. I'm like, in
Mhm.
Bali, women are topless. What are you talking about? Like, and I've been living under Islamic law with like hijab and can't even paint my fingernails. And I just want to go to Bali and wear a bathing suit. And my shoulders are going to be on display. I'm sorry. Like,
Yeah.
it's just kind of like, and if you have a problem with that, there's something really strange going on. So, yeah. Yeah. So you're helping people unpack those really bizarro things. As you do that with people, what are some of the common things that you hear people unpacking?
Oh, there's so many. We looked at I think the big ones that have resonated for millennials are the conversations around modesty and consent,
Yeah.
because so much was put on women's shoulders and girls' shoulders with both of those messages. And I think it can be summed up. So what we did, we took 7,000 women and we surveyed them and we said, "Hey, did you ever believe these things when you were a teenager? Do you believe them now?" And then we asked about their self-esteem in high school, their self-esteem now, their marital and sexual satisfaction if they're married, their likelihood of marrying an abuser, all kinds of different outcome variables so that we could trace, what happens if a girl believes this in high school or what happens if she's exposed to this in high school. And a lot of the messages really had to do with the fact that boys are dangerous and can't help themselves. And so girls, you need to be careful and you need to just control what the boys do and how they treat you. So for instance, ideas like boys are visual in a way that girls will never understand. A boy can't stop in a makeout situation, and so it's your responsibility to put the brakes on. Or a boy can't help but lust if you're dressed like you're trying to incite it. So these messages make it sound like you're never going to be able to experience real intimacy. Intimacy is a pipe dream. All men around you will always objectify you because that is all they care about. And you put that on these little girls, and all you're telling them is this world is never going to be a safe place for you, ever.
Yeah. It's abuse culture, really. I mean,
Mhm,
I've seen people unpack it in that way, more experts on what like abuse culture looks like, and cultures that inherently in the system don't allow consent, or encourage it or provide a way, right? And so it ends up when you have a situation like that. And I'm thinking of the SBC, right? As I always say, the denomination that raised me to know Jesus, and I'm very grateful for, but at least in the U.S. context in particular, is the Department of Justice is having to get involved because there were systems within it where it's like, oh, well, we just don't talk about that. Or
mhm,
a way a girl would end up blaming herself if something happened. It's like, well, what did you do? Like, you come and you say, this happened to me to somebody in the church. It's like, well, what were you wearing? Or what did you say? Or were
mhm,
you in the wrong place? Or you shouldn't have done this or that. And when cultures are already like that, and then you have like this whole intense couple of decades of purity culture books being written in youth groups and youth camps, and it's
mhm.
so astronomically difficult. So in your book, as you were writing this, how did you sort of navigate, and what kind of information are you giving people in terms of how they can do better together in this whole conversation?
Well, one of the big things we wanted to show people is, okay, what are the outcomes of these common teachings? And then we showed them where the teachings were. Like we gave examples. So here, let me give you a good one about consent. Shanti Feldon, in her book for young women only, she asked a bunch of survey questions to boys. So I'm about to give you a stat. I do not believe this stat is correct. I think that her survey questions were very badly written. The possible answers the boys could choose from were very badly written. And then her analysis of the results was very bad. So I'm going to tell you something. It's not true. but,
Yeah.
but what she told her readers was that 82% of boys felt either little ability or little responsibility to stop in a makeout situation. And her conclusion that she put in a nice big bubble and bolded it was, if you want to stop it, safest to not even start. Now, 100% of boys have the ability to stop.
Yes.
100%.
Yes.
How can you tell girls that 82% of boys have little ability to stop in a makeout situation? That is straight up rape culture.
Yeah, it is.
But when we believe this about men, and this is what has largely been taught in evangelical circles, the idea of every man's battle. Lust is every man's battle. Men have this insatiable sex drive, where we equate the objectification of women with male sexuality. Then when a guy does something to a girl, it obviously must have been her fault because he can't act any other way. That would be acting against his maleness, and God made him male. So isn't this wonderful that God made him this way? And so you, as the girl, were created to help protect him from himself.
Yeah.
And that's
It
what was put on girls. And we talked to so many girls, well, women now in our focus groups, who said they didn't know they had been date raped
ugh,
for a decade or two because
mm,
they had listened to these messages and they thought, well, I consented to kissing. So what did I
ugh.
expect?
It's victim blaming in the system. They don't even have to victim blame them after, because they're going to do that inherently because of how it's already been scripted for them, right?
Mhm.
It's so heartbreaking, which is why it's so important that you just speak the truth out loud. But I know that when you've spoken the truth out loud, it has not gone well, as it often does not for women. They just would like to keep us small and silent and nice and sweet over in the corner. And when we do that, we watch these things happening. And there's something about the Holy Spirit and our giftings that it rises up in us, and we just have to say something. And so I'm so glad that you have. But that's turned out to be, I know that Shanti Feldon in particular has made comments on a podcast recently, um, insinuating that it's this Twitter mob out to get celebrity
Mhm.
pastors, when just reasonable pushback on a theological difference or a philosophical difference that could be dangerous is being voiced in a very appropriate way that you have done. But yeah, how do you respond to that type of narrative?
Yeah, so what she was saying on the Theology in the Raw podcast, and she never actually named me, but I know that the I know this is about me. I was on the same podcast 2
Podcast.
weeks ago,
Mhm.
and I had named her and given some of the quotes from her book for young women only. And she and I have had a big back and forth in emails behind the scenes. She's written a statement about me, so much of what she was saying had to do with me. And her point was that in Jesus we should all be loving one another, and we should be going to one another privately, not publicly, because that isn't kind. And we need to remember that everyone deserves love. So, yes, the victims deserve love, but so does the pastor, and so do the authors, and we should be treating people accordingly. I find this very difficult because she never admitted that she did harm and that other authors have done harm. This is not a
Mhm.
question of a difference of opinion.
Right.
That's the whole point of what we did, both in Great Sex Rescue and in She Deserves Better. We did surveys. Okay, so 20,000 women for Great Sex Rescue, 7,000 women for She Deserves Better. And we can now quantify what happens when people believe the things she taught. In fact, in She Deserves Better, we actually used her wording in some of our survey questions for beliefs, because she criticized us in Great Sex Rescue, saying she never taught what the things that we were critiquing her for, because a word or two was off. And so we used her actual wording in the survey so that we couldn't get that critique. And it was devastating.
Mm.
You know, the things that she taught, for instance, the modesty messages that she taught. If you believe that all boys are visual in a way that girls will never understand, you have a 52% higher rate of experiencing vaginismus, higher chance of experiencing vaginismus as an adult, which is a really bad sexual dysfunction disorder, which makes intercourse very painful, if not impossible. You have a 68% higher chance of marrying an abuser. You have a 30% higher chance of having low self-esteem long term if you believe this as a teenager, even if you don't believe it today. So this stuff has lifelong impacts.
Yeah.
And for her not to acknowledge that and just act like this is just a difference of opinion is not okay,
Mm.
because this is real harm. She has sold millions of books and she's done real harm.
Mm.
And there was no humility. And to say that it's just a Twitter mob coming after her and that we should all just go privately, I find that really ironic, because she was saying this while she was on an extremely large podcast. So she is able
Right.
to get on a very large podcast in order to shape the narrative.
Yeah.
If you, as a woman, read for women only and were traumatized by her depictions of men's propensity to lust, what recourse do you have except Twitter or except social media?
Right.
Because she's in her book, Through a Man's Eyes, she actually records stories of people coming to her privately, and she ignored them. She said that they just didn't get it. And so now she's writing a whole other book about the same thing to double down. So people have gone to her privately and she's ignored them. And so to say that people should not be discussing this in social media simply means that the powerful get to stay in power and no one should ever challenge them.
That's not Jesus. That's not the one we follow. I mean, we look at what he was doing, and his harshest words were from some of the religious, powerful people, and the people on the margins, the people who had to access him through Twitter on a DM, right? Were the ones he was like, you know, they're tagging his robe because they've been bleeding for 12 years, and he notices among the crowd that he could have been a celebrity pastor of, but he rejected that, right? And so yeah, it's kind of bizarro to think about it in terms of following Jesus in that way. And yet I know that psychologically it has to be really difficult to admit someone to we don't like admitting we're wrong. I mean, human
Yep.
beings, we don't like that. It takes a great deal of deep work and humility on our part to do that, and certainly to do it on a grand scale of having sold that many books and having a career built on that message. And yet we've seen people do that. And it's remarkable when it happens, so that we have good examples of people who've been like, you know what, pull my book because I was wrong, or let me
Mhm.
rewrite it.
I've done that.
Um,
I've pulled
yeah,
2 books. I've rewritten 2 books. I took down, well, my blog had 3,000 blog posts, and I switched servers, I switched domains, and I deleted 1,500 posts.
yeah,
You know?
exactly.
Mhm. And you
Yeah,
know
I
what? It isn't that I actually didn't find it that hard,
no,
and
yeah,
people appreciated it.
They do, because we're human. We can be wrong. It's okay. Great
Yeah.
scholars also find new information. And when you have new information, then you're like, oh, guess what? I should change this because now I know better. But
Mhm.
to act like you have all the answers and that you're infallible, well, that's reserved for only one. And we worship that one. And it's not a
Right.
human, right?
And I think what the reason that we've done so many studies and done this really in a data-driven way is because there have been so many debates about this, but they've mostly been theological debates
Yeah.
over the years. What is the correct marriage teaching? Can you divorce for abuse? And how should we talk about sex? And when things are only in the theological realm, it's hard to make progress because people can just say, well, your interpretation of the Bible's wrong, or you just
Right.
don't believe the Bible.
Right.
And so our idea is, you know what? Let's just take Jesus at his word. Jesus said that a good tree can't bear bad fruit and a bad tree
Mhm.
can't bear good fruit. And so you can recognize things by their fruit. So we thought, okay, if these teachings are so great, then they should stand up to scrutiny.
They should.
And over again, what we found is that the big things that are taught in evangelical circles about sex, about gender relations, about power in marriage, they don't stand up. They bear
No,
really bad fruit because
they
it's
do.
not based in Jesus.
Yeah. Yeah. And, you know, case in point, another controversial thing that's happened on Twitter in the last little bit is the Josh Butler article out of the Gospel Coalition. And similar situation, right? I mean, it's also I've not been someone who's experienced sexual assault. But I when I read I didn't read the whole article as I don't think it's probably a good idea for me to do that. Just where I'm at and just recovering from abuse of different kinds from
Mhm.
a church I was involved with. But um reading even just the little excerpts that were on, quoted and screenshotted and things like that on Twitter and hearing people engage about his book and reading that, I was shocked at how anything like that could have passed through a group of people and no one would have noticed how this sounds like rape. What he's describing
Mhm.
from my perspective as a woman who have friends that have been raped, most women have these friends because statistics bear out that we know a lot of people.
Mhm.
I was so shocked and it just read exactly like a rape situation to me. And then when it was equated with the gospel itself, it's just nauseating. And the fact
Mhm.
that it's now being defended and saying that a Twitter mob is now against this is what is going on. So what is your response to the Josh Butler situation as it stands now in that article itself?
Well, at first, I was very heartened because it was like one of the first times I've ever seen all the different um, types of Christianity uniting under one banner, which is to collectively say, "Ooh, what did I just read?" Like, like
Right.
I think the article dropped on a Wednesday, and by Thursday, everybody was saying, my eyes, make it go away." And for a while, it looked like it worked because they did take the article down, but then within about 24 hours of them taking the article down, this new narrative came out that everyone had tried to cancel Josh Butler. And poor Josh. First of all, Josh has not lost his living. Okay. He is still
No.
pastor of a very large church and he got a six-figure advance for this book, which he gets to keep. So he has not lost his livelihood.
Right.
Um, but none of us were coming after Josh. If anything, I was coming after the Gospel Coalition, who had allowed this stuff to be published and who had put Josh in that position.
Yeah.
We were not coming after Josh. We were coming after the ideas.
Hmm.
And he described sex in such a way, exactly, it made it sound like rape. Women's experience was entirely absent. He actually quoted me in chapter 1 and he completely missed the point of my quote. It
Yeah.
was it was really interesting because I was talking about female orgasm and he made it sound like romance. And he just I don't know from reading his book if he truly understands anything about the sexual response cycle, about women's bodies or anything. And this
Doesn't
is one
sound
of
like
my
it.
bigger critiques too. If you look at all of the books that I have found are really harmful, like Love and Respect,
Hmm.
Every Man's Battle for Adults, for Women Only, or the books that we analyzed in She Deserves Better, are books for how to talk to your teenagers about all this stuff, like For Young Women Only, Lies Young Women Believe, Every Young Woman's Battle, Passion and Purity. They're all written by people that are not qualified to write on this stuff.
Yeah.
They are not licensed therapists.
No.
They do not have specialized training in sex. They haven't done research. They're not peer reviewed.
Hmm.
And they by and large, they do not use peer-reviewed research to inform their perspectives.
No.
And we need to raise the bar on what counts as advice
Yes.
in evangelical circles. Just because someone is a pastor does not mean that they know that they are qualified to speak about sex.
No. And just like somebody that might even have a PhD in theology or anything, they don't know everything about theology. They just know very narrowly what they did their dissertation on. They are not an expert on every single subject. And I think that's where things have gotten pretty twisted in the power dynamics as well in the evangelical church here in the US in particular. I'm noticing is that the narrative or the kind of air people breathe is you just can't question these people. They're untouchable, or you have to
Mhm.
approach them in very special ways as if their egos are so large that they might fly off the handle at any moment. This is not godly. This is not Jesus. No one is a king. We have a king. We worship Jesus as king, and
Mhm.
no one else has that power over another human being. In fact, Jesus was flipping hierarchy the majority of what we read about in his ministry. And so for people to not be able to be questioned is troubling all by itself in a spiritual sense. But as you said, academics constantly are writing counterpoints to each other's paper. Like, this is normal. It's not called a Twitter mob. It's just academic work. What is your
Mhm.
response to how we could do better, as you mentioned, in this way?
Yeah, we need to remember Jesus said that he is the way, the truth, and the life. So he is the truth. So as we find out more about the world, we're actually finding more about Christ and about how he made us and about, what intimacy really means and what it means. Like we're as we find this stuff out, we are growing more godly. We aren't growing away from God. And to say, I can never be questioned, what you're really saying is, I do not want to grow. And I don't
Mm,
want any of you to grow. I just want to maintain my power.
mm,
I said things 15, 20 years ago that I would never say today. And I've gone back and forth and I thought, like, was it wrong when I said it? Or was it just a different time and we didn't know as much? And it needed to be said in order to move us towards what I'm saying now. And I'm kind of like, yeah, maybe that was what it was. Like we needed to go through these stages of development of realizing, okay, wait, there is something wrong here, even if I'm not quite articulating it properly, just so that we could see it more clearly. And I think in 20 years, I'm hoping our kids and grandkids will see it even more clearly.
mm.
Um, but we have to be able to question things. And
Yeah.
if someone truly loves Jesus, they're not going to feel threatened by that. They're going to invite it.
Mm. Yeah, absolutely. In terms of your work and your writing for the church, for women, for parents in this case, men and women both suffer under this misunderstanding of how our bodies work, how God created each of us as image bearers, how God created sex to be a beautiful um, expression, not at all like the Josh Butler article, but actually truly beautiful, where it's a mutuality and it's not just a woman serving a man and his quote unquote needs.
Mhm.
Um, what are some of the narratives that you're having to continually reword for people that you find?
And I think for adults, it is this idea that men want sex and women don't, and so women need to service men and take care of their needs so that men don't sin in some way. For girls, it's a little bit different. It's really that boys are insatiable and they can't treat you well unless you do all of these things first. So you need to cover up. You need to be unconditionally respectful, and you need to bolster their egos because boys have very fragile egos. And all of these things are taught, and it makes girls sound so small.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that's what it's telling girls. Don't use your voice. You're a problem. Girls, you are a problem. And the modesty messages to girls tell girls you should not be seen. But then because we have mostly male leadership, because we believe things like girls talk too much, Shanti Feldon actually put that in her book, Girls Talk Too Much. Brio
What?
magazine, oh yes, from Focus on the Family, it was constantly telling girls, you talk too much. Boys don't like girls who talk too much.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, it was a big message that, and many women believed that as teenagers, that
Wow.
girls talk too much. I need to be quiet. And so in evangelicalism, we teach girls you can't be seen and you can't be heard.
Mm,
You exist to support the boy. And I just want girls to know that you have a plan and a purpose all on your own, and you
mm.
can thrive, and you have permission to be big. And
Yeah.
that's what She Deserves Better is doing, hopefully, is helping parents, first of all, reparent themselves so that they
Mhm.
can hear that healing message, because a lot of us didn't hear it. And then also how they can pass that on, especially to their daughters.
Mm. Heartbreaking because I mean I just preached a few weeks ago on Palm Sunday at a church here in the Bay Area on Mary Magdalene and her Magnificat and how she influenced Jesus's social justice ministry. And I think the voice of women, the voice of a mother, the voice of women, girls and women in men's lives are there because God wanted us to be voices in one another's lives. There's no bigger
Mhm.
or lesser voice. But in terms of examples of Jesus with people, as he was with women, he seemed to always be elevating and amplifying their voices because he himself was living in a culture, the Greco-Roman world was swimming in patriarchy, and our
Mhm.
cultures are today too, but maybe in a more intense way at some point, at some points in time in some cultures. And so Jesus was amplifying the voices of women because he was trying to work for equity at the way God himself created God's daughters to be equal and work shoulder to shoulder in this kingdom work. And so it's so heartbreaking to hear that there's messages out there that women talk too much because that's not only not godly, I don't think it's statistically true.
Yeah,
Am
it
I
actually
wrong?
isn't. The idea got started. We traced it back to James Dobson in 1983. He wrote a book called Love for a Lifetime, where he claimed, and I might have the numbers wrong, but like women say 25,000 words a day, whereas men only say 12,000. And so the point was, ladies, when he gets home from work, he has already said all of his words for the day, but you're just waiting to go at him, and you need to just be quiet and let him be. And then
Mhm.
Gary Smalley took the same idea. I think he said 50,000 versus 25,000. Other
What?
people said 14,000 versus 7,000. Like the numbers kept changing, but the
What?
idea was the same, that women speak about twice as many words as men. No one ever gave any citations. And so actual researchers started paying attention to this and we're going, wait a minute, why is everyone making these claims? So they measured it. And multiple studies have found this, and meta-analyses have been done now that show it, that men and women say virtually the same number of words in a day. There's no statistical difference.
That makes sense to me.
Yep, but we've been taught that women say too much. In fact, if you are in a mixed group, so where there's both men and women, the problem is not that women talk too much, it's that they don't speak enough. So
Yes.
unless there are 80% female in that group, women will not say their fair share. Men will speak more than they should.
That resonates.
Mhm.
And I wonder if a woman does speak equal to a man in that group, if it makes certain men kind of more of the narcissistic type men a little bit uncomfortable
Well,
because they
yeah,
don't know
other
their
studies
place.
have found that if women speak 30% of the time, men estimate that they speak the majority of the time.
This I've read research about this. Yes.
Yeah.
How it's all about perception because you're almost used to in situations like that, I think, as a man being the one speaking more. And so yes, I've read that statistic too. And since I work in business, like you see that kind of thing here and there, but we're working on it in places like in Silicon Valley. Like we have diversity, equity, and inclusion conversations. We're talking about women at work. There's all these events like Microsoft Women. We're all trying to work on these kind of things. And what's sad is in my experience here in the largely white evangelical church in North America has been that is largely absent, or at
Mhm.
least if it exists, it's such a slow, um, uninformed process that feels like it's never going to get there because it's still dealing with these very low level issues. Like equity seems so far out of the imagination. It's like almost you have the SBC is still fighting over women can they even preach or be pastors. We're not even at the point of trying to be fully equitable as God's daughters in the church. And so although this conversation is largely around like the sexual experience and these messages, I think so much of it goes together of where power lies, where voice and agency
Mhm.
lie. Um, and so, what are some things that you would say to parents as they are, like you said, your book is largely about how they can have these conversations. It's not that we're just throwing everything out and saying whatever you want to do is fine.
Mhm.
What are some tips you're giving parents?
Yeah, so in the book, we certainly cover consent and modesty, but we also cover this idea of how you can raise up your daughter's voice, how you can help her trust her feelings. Because girls have constantly been told, the heart is deceitful and wicked above all things. You need to stand on faith, not feelings. You need to be nice. Jesus gave up everything for you. You need to let other people do what they want and not stand up for yourself because that's selfish. And these are the kinds of messages our girls hear. We're also constantly told, women are easily deceived. There's a whole book series on that, Lies Women Believe, Lies Young Women Believe, about how women are especially susceptible to believing lies. That's not actually true. Research has showed the opposite, that women are more likely to be, first of all, to not be heretical in our beliefs as Christians. So women are more likely to hold on to the fundamentals. We're more likely to go to church in general. And we are less likely to be duped in financial schemes. But because people think that we are more easily deceived, we're more likely to be victimized. So we're more likely to be, for people are more likely to try to victimize women. So it's all just a big mess.
Yeah.
And the church has taught our girls that because he needs to be a leader, as a teenager, you need to practice letting boys lead. You need to defer to boys. Shanti Feldon says that we need to give boys unconditional respect, which
Mm-mm.
means you get complimenting them, affirming them, even if they haven't done anything worth affirming. You need to call out the best in them, et cetera, et cetera. And then she has this great line where if you're wondering if you've crossed the disrespect line, look for anger.
Oh gosh.
So she's telling teenage girls, she's telling your 15-year-old daughter that if a boy is angry at you, it's probably because she's disrespected him.
Dear Lord. That's so victim blaming.
It is. It's atrocious. But this is what has been taught, and we need to undo it. And often it doesn't come from parents. Like you could be the best parent in the world, but most of these messages are taught in youth groups. They're on Instagram channels. They're social media influencers, the pop stars they listen to, like they don't always hear it from you. So you could be really healthy. But if
Mm,
this is what they're hearing in a youth group,
yeah.
and youth groups are usually run by a guy who's in his early 20s and often has very little life experience, hasn't worked outside a church situation, has very little experience of women being valued,
Mm.
then what is it that your daughter's going to hear?
Nothing that's going to help her flourish and be who God wants her to be and be able to trust herself, like you said, trust her body to
Hmm.
speak to her and trust her, the Holy Spirit in her, right? Because
Hmm.
if she's being taught to respect all teenage boys in ways that if they get angry, it's her fault, that is a setup for a lifetime of pain and suffering and not just the sadness of her being small and, quenching the Holy Spirit's gift to help her let her light shine and not hide it under the bush like the little song we're taught,
Hmm.
right? But also it's just it's setting her up in her relationships to blame herself, victim blame her to, the Darvo, the whole deny, accuse, reverse victim offender situation that
Hmm.
we see so often, like that's embedded in the system, right? And so it's a setup for if she is around an abusive boy or man that she's so easily groomed. Why would we want to create a situation where girls are easily groomed? We wouldn't, right? So, yeah, tell us some more about how we can do a better job, both as parents and maybe aunties and uncles that have influence on these teenage boys
Hmm.
and girls, or the youth group leaders that we know. How can we be influential?
Well, and I wanna say many youth group leaders are wonderful,
Yeah, of
but
course.
as parents, we need to get to know what is being taught in youth group. Don't just assume because this church is amazing, because this church is huge, because this church has so many youth leaders on staff that that is gonna be healthy. We've actually often found the opposite. The bigger the church, often the more these messages are there. So, just be very careful. Find out what your church teaches. Anything your church believes about gender, it will be exponentially worse in youth group because even if gender stuff is not talked about largely in adult church, in youth group, the majority of what they talk about is relationships. So the majority of it is about sex and gender. So whatever your church believes, it will be exponential given to the youth. I think if I can give one piece of advice to parents, it's this: cultivate a dynamic in your family where your teenagers can disagree with you.
Mm,
Because if your daughter especially can disagree with you, then she's going to be able to disagree when she's in a toxic work situation. She's going to be able to disagree if she's in an abusive relationship, and she might even get out of it faster. When you
mhm.
tell her your voice matters and you won't be penalized for using your voice. Now, I might not go along with what you say, but I'm not going to punish you for saying it. And I'm
Yeah.
so, if you don't think that we should do this as a family and we think we should, we might still do it, but we're going to validate your feelings and we're going to talk about maybe how we can compromise in another way. Like you are allowed to have your own thoughts because too often in the church we have taught parents that children need to obey unquestioningly, and that is grooming children to be abused later.
Yeah. And
And
it's
it
not teaching
also
them to think.
right, and it also is really highly correlated with low self-esteem.
Mm,
And when our girls have low self-esteem, which means they don't think that they matter, they don't think that their voice is important, they're far more likely to marry an abuser. And they're
wow.
far less likely to have good marital and sexual satisfaction later once they are married, if they get married. So let's help them disagree. And when we start to do that, then we can have these conversations about how to spot red flags in systems, in people, so they know how to keep themselves safe. But until they're able to disagree, then they won't be able to recognize, hey, I'm thinking something and I'm not uncomfortable here. If they're not allowed to voice that with you, they won't voice it anywhere else either.
Mm, that's such good advice and a great way to end this. We want to foster curiosity in ourselves and in our children because curiosity leads to knowledge and we want to know. We want to know the truth. The truth sets us free, doesn't it? So, thank you for this conversation. Thank you for the great work you're doing, the research you're doing, the hits you're taking on Twitter and for just continuing to just be faithful to speak the truth and help set people free. It really means a lot to me. And I know that it's meaning a lot to a lot of people because a lot of people aren't dedicated enough or have the time or space or even the courage to do it. So I'm just really grateful for you and the work you're doing, Sheila. Thanks for being on today.
Thank you.